Today is Friday, November 26th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I hope that your family enjoyed a happy Thanksgiving, and I wish you and all of your relatives and friends a happy and holy Advent season as we prepare for Christmas. The first Sunday of Advent is this coming Sunday. Today, I'd like to take up an important topic by which I hope to motivate adult students and also younger students in the Academy and their parents. I'd like to talk about a problem that remains in Catholic education, even if the mission of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is successful. Even if we succeed in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, even if the entire curriculum is restored, even if we're able to promote the classical liberal arts and classical philosophy and Catholic theology, even if we're successful in publishing videos and teaching, there's still a problem that's going to remain, and it's a problem that frustrates me every day, and I understand the reason for it. I understand why it exists. But it's a problem that we can try to ignore and continue trying to ignore and telling ourselves we can just get by without it. But we're never going to make progress. We're never going to move as Catholics to the next level of culture and wisdom until we address this important problem that's right in front of our faces all the time. And the problem is this: in order for Catholic learning and culture to be restored, individual Catholic men and women and younger students, individuals are going to have to choose to ignore the fluffy, superficial studies, all of the enrichment studies, humanities studies, modern school subjects that are just intended for diploma requirements, but all of the easy, casual studies. And at some point, individual Catholics are going to have to commit to taking up the study of the core arts and sciences in the classical Catholic curriculum. Modern schools, whether public school, private school, Catholic school, makes no difference. Modern schools spend almost all of their time, energy, and resources on enrichment-type studies. The core arts and sciences are neglected, and they're neglected for a couple of important reasons. And you'll understand these reasons because these are the reasons that you will ignore these studies. These are the reasons why I'm tempted to neglect these studies. The core arts and sciences, the core on which Catholic learning and true wisdom are based, are very difficult studies. They're very difficult studies. They are not popular. They are very lonely studies. And they do not offer any carnal, financial, or temporal rewards. They are studies that will only be appreciated by men and women who have the desire for wisdom and virtue that's necessary for what Aristotle called the contemplative life. And when I say contemplative life, you shouldn't think of monks or nuns. That's simply one form of the contemplative life. That's the religious contemplative life. But that's not all that it means to be one who seeks and prefers the contemplative life. There's also secular contemplative life, the life that was lived by the ancient philosophers like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. The reason why the study of the core arts and sciences is so difficult is, on the one hand, because the studies themselves are very difficult studies. We have to learn ideas that are uncommon. We have to learn ideas that transcend the normal conversations. That process is very difficult, very wearisome, very time-consuming, very lonely, very difficult. And the other problem, as I said, is that there is no material or carnal, financial, or temporal reward for the study of the core arts and sciences. The reward of those studies is wisdom herself. And unless someone is motivated to possess wisdom herself, not wisdom for the sake of something else, not just enough wisdom to get a job, not just enough wisdom to make some money, but wisdom herself as the greatest of all treasures, pursued for her own sake, that the soul may rest in wisdom. She is the only motivation for these studies. And that's why, the twofold reason why the study of the core arts and sciences is so difficult and continues to be neglected. Even though since 2008 the Classical Liberal Arts Academy has had thousands and thousands of students. In the academy we serve homeschool students, and the parents ultimately decide what courses the children study or don't study. I can't make a student study a certain course. And at the same time, I understand that a modern course or enrichment course that we offer is likely to be better than those same courses elsewhere. So I understand why parents will pursue a modern mathematics course or even a modern science course in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. It also may be because our courses are simply cheaper than they can find elsewhere, and they're just looking for a bargain, and it happens to be found in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. But when I survey the students enrolled in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, there is not a focus on the core arts and sciences. The classical liberal arts are not the focus of those studying in the classical liberal arts academy, as crazy as that may sound. And as I said, it's for two reasons. Number one, the studies are very difficult. Number two, there is no faking it. There is no artificial motivation, no worldly motivation, no carnal motivation, no money to be hoped for by the study of the core arts and sciences. And unless Catholic people can get themselves above vulgar or political interests, there's not going to be a restoration of Catholic learning or culture. It doesn't matter what we get done in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. There are bigger problems caused primarily by democracy, bigger problems in the way of classical culture. Now let me just talk about this for a minute and explain what I meant by what I just said about democracy. In the ancient world, monarchies ruled. And the monarch took direct responsibility for the entire kingdom and all of its resources, all of its actual assets, and all of its potential resources. The monarch was directly concerned with the prosperity of the nation. The monarch was not necessarily interested in fads or in popular movements. The monarch wanted results. The monarch wanted his kingdom to fulfill its potential, to produce the wealth that it was capable of producing the quality of life that it was capable of producing for the peace of his kingdom and also for the glory of his own reign, his own name, for posterity's sake, and of course the immediate benefits of the prosperity of the kingdom during his own lifetime. So kings took the prosperity, results-based prosperity of their kingdoms very seriously. And what they did, we read in the Proverbs teach us, if you find a man skilled in his work, he will stand before kings. If you find a man skilled in his work, he will stand before kings. And that's why in the ancient world there was such motivation for mechanical arts and crafts. Master craftsmen, whether they be architects, military leaders, soldiers, any kind of art that was practically useful. Any kind of art that was practically useful. The king would learn who the master of that art was, and he would call that person into his immediate service. Word would spread through the kingdom, the word would get back to the king, and the king would get in touch with that person and call him to come and serve the king directly. So there was great motivation in the arts, in traditional mechanical crafts and so on. If you could become the best, if you could demonstrate that you are the best at any craft, any art, any skill, you would likely end up serving the king. And that's what motivated ancient workmen. ancient craftsmen. The same continued through Christian history, through the Middle Ages. The same kind of recognition for crafts and skills. See a man excellent in his work, he will stand before kings. That's what motivated workmen through history. But the same thing was true in academics. The same thing was true in learning. The kings surrounded themselves with counselors. And you could find some examples of bad kings in history who either neglected the counsel of wise men or who simply didn't give enough attention to surrounding themselves with good advisors. But in almost every example, in every kingdom you can find, the king surrounded himself with the elders, the older, wise, proven leaders among his people who served as his counselors. Anytime a decision needed to be made, the king would not just make a decision according to his own will, but he would gather his council of elders or his advisors, and he would propose the questions or the problems to them and listen to their recommendations. And when we look back through history, we find that the great kings were surrounded by the wisest men who ever lived. They were these men's counselors. One famous example from the Old Testament, when the Hebrew Joseph is sold into slavery in Egypt, he ends up in prison, and through his spiritual gifts, he has an amazing skill. And that skill is the ability to interpret and explain the meaning of dreams. While Joseph is in prison, he becomes acquainted with two men who happen to be servants of the king's house. I think it was his baker and his cup holder. Men who served at the king's table. Men who would have been the most skillful in their craft in the entire kingdom. But these men found themselves in prison, and through their interaction with Joseph, they learned of his skill in the interpretation of dreams. And so what happens in the story is that word gets back to the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, that there is a Hebrew in prison who has this incredible ability to interpret dreams, who is filled, they say, with the Spirit of God. And so the king of Egypt calls for Joseph to be brought into his presence. This is how this process works, this recruitment process in the ancient world. Because Pharaoh has had a disturbing dream. And Joseph interprets and explains the dream for Pharaoh. And it turns out that this dream was given to Pharaoh by God to save the Egyptian people from a famine that was coming. And Joseph, through his counsel, saves Egypt. And so the king, in response to this interaction with Joseph, elevates him to the highest position in the entire kingdom and puts everything in his control. Because the king wants his nation to prosper. And in order for the nation to prosper, it needs to be administered by a wise man. And so the king wisely delegates the management of his resources and affairs to Joseph because the Spirit of God was in him. And so Joseph is made basically the vice regent, or we can consider it like the chancellor of ancient Egypt. That's one famous example of the recruitment of skilled and wise men in a kingdom and their elevation in the service of the king. Another example is found in the life of David. In the Old Testament, Saul, the king, is troubled by some kind of spiritual disorder. He's tormented by spirits. And he's filled with this torment at various times. And one of the men in his presence suggests that he seek out a musician who, through his music, may be able to charm the spirits and calm the soul of King Saul. And so, question goes around, well, where can we find such a musician? And one of the men in Saul's inner circle says, there is a Hebrew boy who is incredibly skilled in music, and they call David into Saul's presence to perform his music. And his music does in fact calm the soul of Saul. And so Saul keeps David in his presence as his court musician. And this was the function of music in the court, to actually accomplish some moral purpose, not merely to entertain, although there may have been other musicians who were mere entertainers. But David was elevated into the service of the king because of his musical skills. That's how he ultimately comes to fight Goliath. He happens to be in contact with the king, and when everyone is afraid of Goliath, he steps up and says, I can take this giant. But it was through his music that he became acquainted with the king. And we see this all through profane history as well. A famous example is found in the life of Aristotle. When Philip of Macedon conquered Greece, he took Aristotle and appointed Aristotle as his counselor, but also as the tutor of his son Alexander. And so Aristotle, famous for his wisdom, was elevated to the direct service of the king. The same was true in the life of Thomas More. And we can go on and on with examples of wise and skilled men who were called into the service of kings and popes and so on, all through ancient and medieval history. And the reason why I share this is because this changes in the modern era with the advent of democracy. Democracy is, we can say that democracy has some virtues. And we can look back in history and we can find the examples of insane kings who turned into murderers, or we can look at the instability and unrest of kingdoms where there were assassinations and dictators and so on. We can look back to history and find bad stories that make monarchy appear to be dangerous and unstable and undesirable. And this led to the idea that democracy would be better. And democracy rose in the spirit of revolution, out of a spirit of disobedience, and was presented in terms of liberty and justice and rights and so on. But what ultimately happened in modern society is that the vulgar were put in control of the state. And while we can make all kinds of conspiracy theories, we can blame Hollywood, we can blame the media, we can blame all different bad guys or scapegoats, the real evil in modern society is that in democratic countries, the state is run by the will of the vulgar. And this is the exact opposite of everything that was done in the ancient world. Now, the vulgar still existed in the ancient world. The vulgar were considered the common people. The king and the nobles, the king's family, the royalty, as I said, the nobles, and the wise all stood at the height of society and controlled every aspect of that society. The society throughout history was controlled by the wise, either by a monarchy, a king, or if you think of the term aristocracy, it was controlled by the best, the aristoi, that means the best people. The decisions were made by the best people in society, the wisest, most virtuous, most experienced, and so on. Even though the vulgar still existed in the same number that they do today, maybe less, because I believe that there are more vulgar people today in society than there were then, because there's no motivation to not be vulgar in modern society. But in ancient society, the wise ruled and controlled the vulgar. They used their desire for pleasure to control their lives and force them to do good. And they punished them when they refused to do good. The vulgar are people who are motivated only by pleasure. All they can think about is their own pleasure. All they can think about is their own will, their own desires. All of their desires are short-term, carnal, present, material, and so on. They will work for money because money can buy pleasure. They will work for pleasure. They will work, but they will only work if they are given pleasure as a reward. And this is how the vulgar are understood by the leaders of nations and wise men all through history. They're not intrinsically evil, they simply need to be governed by the virtuous, by the wise. They can be made to do good. Slaves in the ancient world were either people who could not be given any freedom at all, or people who could not live with any freedom because they would do evil. So there were slaves who were criminals. There were slaves who were prisoners of wars. There were slaves who were debtors. But whether you were a slave or a free man, if you were vulgar, you were to be ruled by the political, and if you were political, you were to be counseled by the contemplative. Plato explained that the ultimate leader of a nation would be a philosopher who was a king. And so when kings existed who were not themselves philosophers, they simply called philosophers into their court to be their advisors. But in these monarchies or in these aristocracies, there was a hierarchy that reflected the morality of the people. At the bottom level of the society were the vulgar, the common people, the peasants. And you could say that they're good people, but they're only good if they're governed. They're not in and of themselves or left to themselves good. If they're governed by wise men, by just rulers who reward their good work and punish their evil work, then their lives can appear good. But they need to be governed. Then the nobles were those who were primarily responsible for fighting, for defending the kingdom, for protecting the king's interests. And they were the men who were, as Aristotle says, more elegant in mind than the vulgar, because they could be motivated to do things for higher purposes than pleasure alone. A political man could be motivated by fame or by honor. He could be motivated to go live in a field and risk his life for the sake of bringing honor to his family name. The political man was more virtuous than the vulgar. The vulgar couldn't be sent into battle because the vulgar could be bribed. But a political man wished to live honorably, at least as regards temporal honors. He wasn't a man who sought eternal life or eternal favors. He was a man who was motivated by a certain kind of magnanimity, a desire for honor among his own people or on earth. Those kinds of men could be recruited and honored with positions in the nobility, but they were responsible to fight and serve the king. And then lastly, the highest class of men, morally speaking, were the contemplative men. Men who lived for the sake of wisdom. These were the men who could be called in as counselors to kings, but these were also the men who were often put to death by kings, because their disapproval or disagreement with a king could unravel an entire society. This is what happened to Thomas More when he would not go along with Henry VIII's plan to divorce the Queen. His disapproval was so significant in the eyes of the English people that the king couldn't allow him to live and go on expressing this disapproval, even though Thomas More expressed no disapproval at all in public, wouldn't even speak about it. Still, his silence couldn't be tolerated, and the king took his head off. So these wise men were often martyrs because they were the ones who, like the prophets, prophets being good examples of contemplatives, apostles being examples of contemplatives, monks and priests being examples of contemplatives. They were often the ones who, like the prophet Nathan in the Old Testament, had to go to the king and tell him the truth, even when that message would set the king into a rage. That was the work of those contemplatives. And so they could be honored and exalted one day and killed the next day. The same David who was brought into Saul's court to play music and calm his soul was also forced to run for his life and hide from Saul, who wanted to kill him, because God's favor rested on David when the kingdom was taken away from Saul. The wise men often ended up in perilous situations in life that could only be handled by men who lived for a kind of happiness that went beyond this life. And it's this kind of courage that Jesus called all of his disciples to when he said, "Do not fear those who can kill the body, but rather fear him who can throw both body and soul into hell." A wise man doesn't fear those who threaten to kill the body. Many people say that they do not fear death, but by their lives, by their pursuit of pleasure and comforts, by their timidity, prove that what they say is not what they truly mean. Contemplatives are not afraid of dying because they're too wise to be afraid of physical pain. They're too wise to be afraid of dishonor. They're too wise to be afraid of poverty. They're too wise to be afraid of death. And these ancient societies were arranged in this order, where the order of the actual political system mirrored the order of the moral system. But unfortunately, this was overturned when democracy became fashionable in the 1700s. And for the last 250 years, America and many other countries have been governed by the vulgar. They have inherited the achievements and benefits of those ancient and medieval societies. But those resources have been taken up by the hands of a prodigal society that surrenders them to the will of the vulgar. And the society in which we live is evil, not because there's no good in it, or because there's no wise men, or there are no saints, or there are no this or that. Our society is evil because the vulgar are not governed. The vulgar are the ones governing. And so their vulgarity can spread out of control. And the only thing restraining the vulgarity of the vulgar is that the original laws that were established in America, for example, were received from the old world, and they had a lot of the spirit of the old world in them. And that's why many people talk about America being a Christian nation that was founded on Christian principles. And that's completely false. America was a nation that was founded in rebellion against Christian principles, but couldn't separate itself from the Christian principles that were already in place because they were so deeply woven into the fabric of human life. 1760 years into the Christian era. But what has happened over the past 250 years, and what will continue happening, is that the vulgar will continue unraveling that medieval ancient society, one law, one policy at a time. And that's what we see continuing day by day. It's not that some new enemy is suddenly invading and breaking into our Christian world. It's that the consequences of democracy are simply working themselves out little by little over time as the vulgar vote their will into reality one election at a time. There's no more king to say no to the vulgar. There's no more king to set boundaries to the vulgar. There's no more king to prepare society for the vulgar so that their vulgar living can still bring about some good, some common good. The vulgar are free to rush after their own will, and this is what happens generation after generation. We simply unleash some new vulgarity one generation at a time. It gets worse and worse because the restraints on the vulgar are removed cycle by cycle. And of course, most of the people complaining are simply vulgar people who are being denied pleasures. And that's what we have in this party political fighting. We have vulgar people on one side fighting with vulgar people on the other side. And the way that we can see that it's just vulgar against vulgar is that the subjects of their fighting and arguing is all temporal, carnal, material pleasures. That's all it is. One is complaining that he has to wear a mask on his face, as if that's some kind of unbearable torment. That's just a vulgar person throwing a tantrum because he's denied his will. Another person is complaining because he wants to be a homosexual and someone won't let him have what he wants. He's just a vulgar person frustrated by his inability to satisfy his desires. And this is the fighting that goes back and forth. The vulgar fighting against the vulgar. And what we see, little by little, is it becomes more irrational, more violent. And that's simply going to continue. Democracy is a government by the vulgar, for the vulgar. After all, if you take a wise man, he has the same influence in our society as a fool in the street. And since there are 1,000,000 times more fools than wise men, you're going to have a country that's ultimately influenced by the foolish and not the wise. And what most wise men do in the face of this reality is simply withdraw into some useful private pursuit through which they believe they can accomplish some good and try in some way to influence the vulgar to bring some good out of their desire for pleasure. That's all the wise can do, because in democracy, the wise are not brought into the council of the king and allowed to influence all policy, all law, all economics. The wise man can only influence the few people around him. He's not appointed to advise the state. He can simply advise those around him. And what's even more difficult about this is that Scripture teaches us the principle that a wise man or a prophet is not honored in his own place. And so the wise men are not exalted in society as they would have been in the past. They're not made influential as they would have been in the past. They're left to influence those around them, and it's only by human nature that the wise are not honored by those around them. And so the wise are essentially canceled in democratic society unless they can find some way to influence society through the arts or through business, but it won't be through politics. This is why, if you look at the foolishness of political activity, of the politicians, of the political fights and squabbles and all of these uprisings and controversies, and you look at Christian people wrapped up in them just like unbelievers, all you're watching is this battle of the vulgar for control of worldly possessions and pleasures. But if you want to find the wise men, you won't find them in political circles as you would have in the past. You won't find them even in many churches, because frankly there are almost no vocations. And the people who are serving in the church, while they are perfectly capable of fulfilling the office of the sacramental priesthood, and there's no problem with that, for all of the criticism that they receive, it's really unjust, irrational criticism, because the holiness of the people was never affected by local parish priests anyway, not even of bishops. The virtue of people we look back at in medieval and ancient society was affected by the government of entire kingdoms, not by the ministries of priests and bishops. But we'll find some of the wise in religious life, in Dominican monasteries or Benedictine monasteries or Franciscan monasteries, just minding their own business, doing whatever good they can. And if you want to see these wise men, you need to seek them out. Go and watch the videos published by the Thomistic Institute, where Dominicans explain philosophical and controversial subjects, and you'll see the wise living and working today, completely cut off from government. There are still wise men, not necessarily fewer than there ever were before, but they're simply not wanted in the political sphere. They're not called to advise rulers. They're left to teach in obscurity, and being wise, they're content to do so. But there are also wise men to be found in business, and I'm amazed by the wisdom found in business lectures and talks how much higher the morality is among leading business experts than even among many churches. Business leaders are forced to work as wise men outside of the political system in a competitive market where the vulgar continually to creep in through all kinds of legislation and democratic influence that continues to creep into the market, which is supposed to be free, but won't be if the vulgar can control it. The vulgar don't want a free market. They want the market to be governed by them through the government. And of course, they fight with each other about who should get the welfare resources. But in the business sphere, wise men can find ways to be influential through business. And democracy, one of the good things I believe that democracy is going to produce is it's going to actually make war unnecessary. Because the wise men who actually control the greatest world affairs are not going to be political men. The men who control world affairs are going to be the business leaders whose influence is global. For example, we have two contrary powers, the United States and China. And if we look at these two nations from a political or philosophical or military perspective, we find two great powers at odds and possibly on the verge of some global catastrophic war. If we look at the political situation. And yet both of these nations, the wise men in these nations, are not men of politics, but men of business. And what's going to save the world from some geopolitical war is global economics. The benefits that are to be gained through war, political benefits, would not be worth the economic consequences that such a war would bring. The United States knows that. China knows that. Every nation knows that. The only nations that are interested in war are nations who are either ideological and religious, like some of the Middle Eastern states, where they don't even care about issues of economics or comforts of this life or temporal affairs. They consider jihad or holy war to be one of the highest callings in life. Those people threaten the world with war. But the nations have become so interdependent economically that there are a million other ways to control the behavior of other nations. And frankly, the nations don't think that a political victory would be worth the economic losses. What would China be fighting for if to win meant that they had to destroy the U.S. economy? What would they gain? The nation would plunge into poverty. What would America gain by taking out China? What would America gain? our economy would collapse. And so the reality, what's strange in this modern society, is that the political powers that the vulgar are all wrapped up in are just shadows of the real powers that are developing, that ultimately control world events. When you go and listen to talks given by men like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, men like the CEO of Microsoft, whose name I always forget, it's an Indian name. You listen to leaders of global powers in business, and you'll often find that they'll admit that in the past, business leaders were too short-sighted. They committed all kinds of moral errors and evils. They made bad decisions and they paid for them. But the new generation of business leaders are more shrewd. They understand the importance of global relationships. They understand the value of being inclusive. And I can give you a good example of this I just encountered yesterday, which you might want to take advantage of. In the past, there are some resources that I've had the opportunity to make use of because I was actually the administrator of a private school when I ran the boarding school here on campus in North Carolina. It was a registered private school in North Carolina, and that made all kinds of services and resources available to me because I was an administrator of a school. The Classical Liberal Arts Academy is an online curriculum publisher, not a school. When I closed the boarding school, I had to give up many of those benefits. And it was very exclusive. So only schools, let's take a company like Adobe, which produces all kinds of media software, powerful programs, very useful. I can purchase these programs and use them as an individual or as a business owner, but I cannot make use of the benefits offered to school administrators because I do not operate an accredited school, and I'm not interested in doing so. But I don't operate an accredited school, and so their discounts and special services and things like that are offered only to accredited schools. So that stinks. But recently, I was looking into some Adobe products because my daughter is interested in graphic design. And as I was looking, I realized that Adobe has chosen to include homeschools as approved educational institutions. And this is an example of this growing inclusivity among modern businesses. Rather than treat homeschoolers as some kind of countercultural weirdos to be excluded from benefits, leaders of businesses are now becoming more inclusive and are extending benefits to groups that would have been rejected in the past. Now, of course, the vulgar gets wrapped up in these things because they watch the vulgar news media, and they see things like, oh, Microsoft opens this program and welcomes people of various genders or homosexuals and these different, and the media will report on these things to intentionally stir up the vulgar without acknowledging that Microsoft did not create this program to target a certain group, but to benefit many different groups. And so, for example, homeschool families are also welcome now to make use of these services because they're simply inclusive. But again, the news media that's designed to serve the vulgar presents only the pieces of the news that the vulgar will get excited about. And that allows them to drive their ad revenue and so on. Because the vulgar are just stupid. Does the media lie? Of course they do, because they're reporting to the vulgar and they know it will work. And so just as we have the two-party political system, where the vulgar just fight against each other and cancel each other out, we also have the politicized and party-based news media, where the vulgar get their preferred information, get a piece of the truth on every issue, and allow themselves to be kept constantly up in arms for the material benefit of the news media companies that are designed to make a killing off of the vulgar. But the modern business leaders have learned that there are 1.3 billion Catholics in the world. And if we just take a strictly financial position, we see that it's stupid to exclude the Catholics. It's better for business to include them. It's better for business to include all of the different groups in society, and it really does no one any good to exclude anyone. And business leaders are learning these things. Disadvantages that Christians had 20 years ago, they're losing. Of course, the vulgar don't see it that way because all they focus on is the pleasure that they lack and not the many benefits that exist for them if they weren't concerned only with pleasure. If they paid more attention to work, they would see how blessed we are in current society. But that blessedness is coming through the business sphere, not through the political sphere. So that's enough for that. That was a long explanation to come back to a simple point that I was making at the beginning. In America, the pursuit of wisdom, whether we're talking about practical expertise in crafts and mechanical skills, or whether we're talking about the pursuit of philosophy, is not rewarded in the political sphere as it was throughout history, or even in the church. Mastery of a skill like carpentry, mastery of a skill like artwork or painting, sculpting, drawing, musical composition, philosophical study, language studies, poetry, on and on and on. All of the traditional liberal arts. They are not rewarded in the political sphere any longer, and that has sucked much of the motivation out of these pursuits. The only way that a man can thrive in modern society is if his art and skill is joined to a shrewdness in business and marketing. Because then he's in control of his own destiny, and through marketing and business, he can influence others and gain honor in a society for his wisdom, for his skill. He can gain influence through marketing and business. But he cannot gain that influence through politics, because politics is in the hands of the vulgar. Unless he wants to become some kind of demagogue that just stirs people up into frenzies for the sake of votes. But wise men are not going to do that. Wise men are not going to be interested in just leading a mob of crazies by basically tricking them for their votes. Business is much more attractive because at least we're accountable to results. And we can do something useful. We can do something that's honest. We can do something that's sustainable in business. And that's why we see so much the private sector becoming more influential even in government-subsidized activities. We see NASA, for example, turning to SpaceX, which is a private company, for its resources. So the study of the core arts and sciences, more than ever before in history, requires great virtue and wisdom, great sincerity in those who will study it, because we can say right up front, there is no reward in this temporal sphere for these studies. And if you cannot comprehend why you would ever do something, if you couldn't be rewarded for it financially or materially or with human honor, that if those things are taken away, you just have no taste for a traditional pursuit, then you're never going to study these arts and sciences. And that's what we see even among Catholic families. We see no interest at all for the pursuit of classical reasoning. We see no interest in classical rhetoric. We see no interest in classical languages, no interest in sacred scripture, no interest in classical mathematics, no interest. And yet we see Catholic families coming into the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and signing up for courses like modern chemistry, algebra, modern arithmetic, and so on. It's as if they want to appear to have an interest in traditional Catholic culture, but not really. And that's why, as I said, even if the Classical Liberal Arts Academy achieves its goals and fulfills its mission, there's going to be no change in Catholic culture. There's going to be no improvement in Catholic learning. There's going to be no change in the number of vocations to the priesthood or to religious life. There's going to be no change, because the Classical Liberal Arts Academy will simply succeed in researching, restoring, publishing, and teaching the classical liberal arts, all of the core arts and sciences, but no one will study them. And I could go on and try to stir up interest in the academy by adding all kinds of gimmicks and fake courses and all kinds of nonsense, but I have no interest in doing that. I've even made the entire program free, and you will still find that Catholic families have no interest in the core arts and sciences, because all that they can think about is, what are you going to do with this. And what they mean by that is, how are you going to turn this into money or pleasure? That's what they mean. What are you going to do with the knowledge of the classical languages? How about study and translate the inspired scriptures? That doesn't attract you? If that doesn't attract you, I don't know what else could possibly attract you. Why study the art of reasoning? Maybe so that you don't get deceived in life? If that's not a concern of yours, then no, I don't know what I could possibly say you could do with mastery of classical reasoning other than avoid being deceived, which is one of the chief concerns in this life. If that's not a concern for you, no, I don't know how you could turn mastery of classical reasoning into some lemonade stand and make money, or make your house more comfortable with mastery of classical reasoning. And what you see is there's no motivation, because the political system doesn't reward these arts and sciences with temporal benefits. And Catholics, rather than looking beyond things that are celebrated and honored politically, rather than looking beyond that and asking broader questions, transcendent questions, they don't do that. They just choose to stay down with the vulgar and fight over all of the stuff of this life. And that's what they're doing. Just look at the behavior of Christians in political circles. It just gets more and more vulgar. They're not even ashamed anymore to curse at one another. You go on Facebook or Twitter and watch these political discussions where the Christians talk about liberals and Democrats. Watch the foul language. It's pure vulgarity. Why? Because these are the vulgar. And it just becomes increasingly vulgar. The political influencers love getting people riled up, and they've got Christians believing so strongly that their political careers are such real concerns that Christians are willing to curse at other people, share the most crude jokes and images publicly, with no sense of shame or modesty or concern for what's proper in a public discussion. And what you see is that the restriction that used to be imposed by the rules and laws and the etiquette of the old world, that was advised by wise men and enforced by kings, is no longer being enforced, and the hearts of people are being let to run free. And so even those who in past generations would have been restricted or restrained by the disapproval of others, today face no such restraint. Christian mothers talk like truckers because the vulgar are simply unhinged, unrestrained. And for people to take up these studies to restore Catholic learning and Catholic culture, all of the artificial motivations have been taken away. And we're forced to choose things on their own merits, out of true motivation, with the right motives and sincere interests. And all of the artificial motives are taken away. That's why there are no vocations today. In the Middle Ages, if you became a religious, you gained all kinds of temporal benefits, and that's not true anymore. Today, you have to be a lover of wisdom. You have to be a lover of holiness. You have to be a person filled with a desire for heaven to want to be a religious. And there are none. And so, even though the Classical Liberal Arts Academy may grow and succeed, nothing is going to change. Because behind the scenes, when I look at what the families are actually doing, what the kids are actually studying, even men come in and enroll in courses in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, pay no attention to the core arts and sciences, read the curriculum page on the website, completely ignore it, and sign up for some enrichment course, I guess because it's free. And you can pretend you're doing something by signing up for a free course that has nothing to do with the classical liberal arts. It's just offered to help students satisfy modern requirements while they study the classical liberal arts. What families do, though, is just go right past the classical liberal arts, and they're signed up for all the humanities courses, they're signed up for all the modern math courses, modern sciences. They'll stay away from Latin and Greek and Hebrew, and they'll focus on English grammar. Can't comprehend the value of the core arts and sciences, can't comprehend why anyone would be willing to pursue wisdom if she doesn't make us any money, if she doesn't get us a diploma. Nothing is going to change unless Catholics, one by one, choose to live and pursue the right things for the right reasons. We can fake it. We can pretend we're doing something different. We can pretend we're interested in wisdom and sign up for a classical literature course. But classical literature is not a core art, not a core science. And you're not going to be able to do anything in a literature course if you don't know the classical liberal arts. You're not going to be able to do anything in a sacred scripture course if you're not studying the classical liberal arts. You're not going to write well if you're not studying moral philosophy and rhetoric. You're not going to defeat anyone in an argument when you yourself don't know the art of reasoning. And we can just go on faking it and faking it and faking it and getting wrapped up in all of the vulgar issues and pretend that our political activity is some kind of love of wisdom. But we're just kidding ourselves. Until Catholics can find the motivation to pursue wisdom for her own sake, there's not going to be any change in Catholic learning or Catholic culture. It's just going to be a society of people who are pretending to be something that they're not.